The release of Darktide is just around the corner. The 41st Millennium's answer to Vermintide sees players facing off against hordes of chaos-corrupted humans in the dense confines of a hive world. Among those enemies are Poxwalkers, Traitor Guardsmen, and of course, chaos-corrupted OGRYN. Big and brutish, these hulking slabs of muscle make for the perfect shock troops for traitor forces. But outside of a single plastic model and some out-of-production Forge World models, Chaos OGRYNS haven't made much of an appearance outside of the game world. So I plan to remedy this by showing you how to build a squad of renegade OGRYNS inspired by those found within Darktide. The basis of the squad would come from the regular Astra Militarum OGRYNS found within the OGRYNS kit. This contains 3 models along with a few options for armor and weaponry that we can benefit from in the conversion. After clipping away the parts required to build the legs and torso of the OGRYNS, the components were cleaned up of any mold lines and sprue tabs. Once cleaned, the torsos were all assembled. However, one thing I failed to spot before assembly were the Imperial icons on the belt buckles. These would need to be removed, and while it would have been easy to do this before assembly, it wasn't impossible now that they've been glued together. For each of these belts, a scalpel was used to carefully shave away the symbol whilst trying to maintain the rivets in the corners. The bulk of the plastic was first cut away before a scraping motion was employed to flatten out the surface. This was repeated across all 3 torsos, giving me the basis for each conversion. For the first of the 3 Chaos OGRYNS, I started with the OGRYN armor, but in order to help separate it from its loyalist counterparts, I opted to remove the track armor. The bulk of the track section was removed with clippers, making the cut as close to the main armor itself as possible. The cut was pretty messy though, so things needed to be cleaned back, which was done with my knife. The remaining hinge was steadily trimmed back until the armor had a flat edge where the segments had once been. In addition to this, the aquila from the chest was removed too, using the same shaving steps that were performed on the belt buckles. Once completed, both armor panels were glued to the torso. At this stage in the build, I had decided to do a head swap with one of the Thundertusk riding ogres, but I ultimately decided against it as it didn't quite look right. But as this realization came a little later, the head remained in place during the next few steps, but just pretend it isn't there. For the first OGRYNS weapon, I opted for the maul, but it didn't quite feel chaosy enough. I fixed this by first drilling several 3mm holes through the center of the maul. The angles were mostly perpendicular to the maul, but I did add a slight deviation to them in order to create a more haphazard appearance. Into these holes, some 3mm plastic rod was inserted and clipped off at an angle to create a sharp point. After gluing a few of these rods into place, the weapon and the arm were assembled before being attached to the torso. For the left arm, things were kept pretty simple. I grabbed one of the shield-wielding arms and, after making a few comparisons against a gun-carrying left hand, I made a few trims around the hand and to the wrist so the 2 parts could be glued together. Finally, the completed arm was glued to the torso. So, back to the head. By this point in the build, I'd realized it didn't quite work. It just didn't look chaotic enough, and so it was removed. Fortunately, the glue hadn't completely cured, so this wasn't too difficult. I had to trim the neck smooth though, so it returned to its original shape. To replace this head, I settled on one of the Crypt Horror's heads. These were the right size and ugly enough to represent a chaos-corrupted OGRYN. This particular head needed a little clipping and trimming to remove the necklace, but once this was done, I could glue the head into place. Continuing with the Crypt Horror components, I grabbed one of the spikes with a torso impaled onto it, which meant that I'd gotten my dead animal bits requirements for this video out of the way nice and early. This part would help massively to create that brutality that an OGRYN without the restrictions of the Imperium would demonstrate. To attach this component, another 3mm hole was drilled, this time into the OGRYN's armor. After comparing the spike, the hole needed to be widened a bit, but once the 2 were fitting together, some glue was used to make the bond permanent. Continuing with the theme of gruesome trophies, some Citadel skulls had their back halves clipped away so that they would be positioned flat against the armor, but before they were glued, a 1mm hole was drilled through the skull. I then glued the skull to the belt buckle and then inserted a length of 1mm plastic rod into the previously drilled hole. The rod was clipped so that just a small amount was left protruding, giving the impression that the skull had been impaled on a spike attached to the armor. This process was repeated across the rest of the armor until the grisly trophy rack had been created. The second OGRYN would, like the first, also be equipped with the Bullgrin armor, so I set about the same clipping and trimming process as I had previously done. But once this had been done, the armor wasn't glued together just yet and was instead dry fitted against the torso. As I wanted to attach some Ripper gun carrying arms to this model, some checks were done to make sure everything would line up. After a quick check of the arms, it was clear that the section of the armor that ran beneath the armpits would get in the way. So this was clipped away and smoothed flat a little further before being glued to the torso. With the armor now fixed to the torso, I could get an idea of how the arms would line up against the armor. They weren't designed to work together, so it was inevitable that a little trimming and shaving of the shoulder and armor was required. After the initial trims, the gun was also compared. This revealed that the chest armor itself also needed to be cut back a bit in order to make some room. Fortunately, damaged and broken looking armor works particularly well for this kind of model. Once all the trims and adjustments had been made, the weapon and arms were attached to the torso. Continuing with the armoured look of this OGRYN, one of the kit's shoulder pads was liberated from its aquila in the same way as earlier. Following this, a number of 3mm and 1mm holes were drilled into the shoulder pad's surface. I wanted to create a spiked armour, and so into these holes some more plastic rod was glued. These rods were clipped and sharpened to a point to create some rough and haphazard spikes. This addition of spikes was repeated across the second shoulder pad as well as the armor. Once completed, the shoulder pads were glued into place, completing this ogre's armor. The only thing left to do to complete the second OGRYN was to attach the magazine, a few pouches, and finally another crypt horror head. For the final model, I wanted to lean into the trigger-happy mentality of the OGRYNS and give him a slightly upgraded version of his Ripper gun. This was done by first clipping away the muzzle of the Ripper gun before shaving back the surface it was removed from. This would be replaced by the barrel of a House Orlok heavy stubber. After drilling out the barrel, it was then clipped away from the rest of the gun before also being smoothed flat at the contact point. After gluing the Ripper gun's two halves together, the barrel was attached, followed by the new extended barrel. To give the gun the appearance of being fired, I took one of the streams of bullet casings from the flash git sprue and glued it to the Ripper gun's ejection port. Finally, everything was attached to the torso. You'll have noticed that I decided not to use the chest armor this time around, but I still wanted a shoulder pad. So, like before, the aquila was removed and the pad was glued to the OGRYN's left shoulder. To complete the feel of a spray and pray mentality, an ammo pack was taken from the Goliath Stimmers kit. This would normally have two ammo belts running from it, but as these wouldn't fit onto this model, I instead opted for another Orc flash kit part. One of those loose ammo belts was attached to the opening at the bottom of the pack, before the pack was glued to the OGRYN's torso. Next up was another crypt horror head, but this time around I did have to do a tiny bit of trimming in order for the head to fit. While mostly complete, the OGRYN was lacking the skulls and spikes of the previous models. To resolve this, I simply combined the two things and used the same trimming and drilling that I'd performed earlier on the skulls. These, along with some empty rods, were glued into the right arm of the OGRYN. Finally, all that was needed now was a few extra pouches and pieces of equipment which were glued to the model. With that completed, the models were ready to be painted. But first, let's hear a little bit about the sponsors of this video, Serious Readers. One tool that is often overlooked in this hobby is the humble light. Many people will say that brushes, paints, or clippers are what you need for success, but I've always found that making sure you have a decent lighting setup can do wonders for your hobby experience. And that's where Serious Lights come in. Each light is fitted with daylight wavelength technology, which means that they replicate the daylight spectrum as closely as possible. For me, this not only means that I have a good neutral color to paint with, but it's also much easier on my eyes during those long painting sessions. Personally, I'm using the Gemini high definition floor light, which features two separately adjustable lights. Made here in the UK, the light features industrial strength, posable steel arms for flexibility in positioning, intensity adjustments, and focusing rings, meaning you can always get the light just as you need it, regardless of what you're using it for. Be it building and painting miniatures, reading, admiring your artifact collections, adjusting your unholy robes, or recording a voiceover like I am right now from this script, which seems to know exactly what it is I'm about to say, even though I don't remember writing it. What terrifies me the most is, does the script know what I'm about to say? Or is the script telling me what to say? Regardless of what you need your light for, Serious Lights have you covered. So if you want to pick up one of these lights for yourself, follow the link down in the description and use the offer code PETE22. This will give you a free compact light with any purchase from the Serious Lights range, plus free international shipping. A big thank you to Serious Readers for sponsoring this video. The OGRYNS in Darktide, like almost everything in that game, are very dark, so it made the most sense to prime the models with a black primer. This was done through my airbrush, using some of Vallejo's black airbrush primer, but feel free to use a rattle can if you prefer. After the primer, the first step was to tackle the areas that would remain black, or at least very dark. It's unusual for black surfaces to actually look completely black. They usually reflect at least a small amount of light, so often appear more as a very dark grey or similar dark colour. To mimic this effect, I would apply a starting layer of Vallejo's black grey to these areas. I applied this through my airbrush, but a similar effect could be achieved with some dry brushing too. The intention here was to coat the areas that faced upwards, but leave the deepest recesses as the original black, mimicking the effects of shadows. To create a few areas where the light was more intense, a little eyeshadow was mixed into my original black grey. This was applied in small amounts, mainly across the areas like the shoulders and the top of the guns. Eyeshadow is a good colour for lightening paint, whilst also keeping a slightly warmer hue that mimics the effect of a warm-toned source of light. After the first application, a little more eyeshadow was added to create an even lighter tone. This was sprayed over the same areas as last time, but the area of focus was reduced even further to create some small spots of intense light. After the airbrushing, the next step was to bring out those surface details with some highlights. These highlights were created by again mixing together some black grey and ice yellow. These were mixed together in varying amounts to create two highlights, one lighter than the other. The first highlight was used to line edge the black areas. By giving these details a fine, lighter line of paint, it would help them to stand out against the darker surfaces and recesses, adding depth to the model. In addition to the edge highlights, I also applied a few perpendicular lines emanating from the edges to create the appearance of surface scratches and damage. The second, lighter mixture was used as an extreme highlight. Rather than lining all the edges with this paint, I focused predominantly on the corners where two edges converged. This helped to create the appearance of sharpness, further enhancing those details. With the armor complete, I could turn my attention to the skin. The first step of this was to give all of the exposed flesh a base coat of brown rose. Now, when applying paint over a dark base coat such as this, it's important to water down your mixture and apply several thin layers rather than a single thick one. After 2 or 3 layers, you'll be left with a solid colour and a much smoother overall finish. To give the skin a little shading and to create more of an unnatural hue, I mixed some Luxion Purple contrast paint into some Vallejo glaze medium. This helped to reduce the intensity of the bright purple and would help to create a subtle purple hue to the flesh once applied across all of the skin. After this first layer had been applied and allowed to dry, a second, more focused application was done. This was targeted mainly into the recesses and around the undersides of the surfaces, giving the flesh a degree of shading whilst maintaining an unnatural coloration. The skin was then highlighted in much the same way as before by using some basic skin tone to tackle the edges of the facial features and the musculature. For the rotten corpse on the maul-wielding OGRYN, the torso was given an all-over base coat of brown rose. To give the model that rotten effect, another contrast paint was mixed with some glaze medium. The dull green of Creed Camo would help to give the flesh a rotten and necrotic look. Following this, a little Flesh Tearers red was mixed with some medium before being applied across the skin. When combined with the previous layer, the result was more of a blooded and bruised flesh effect. In addition to this overall layer, a slightly less diluted Flesh Terror's red was targeted directly into the exposed organs and the insides of the OGRYNS' mouths. Finally, just like before, the corpse's flesh was highlighted with some basic skin tone. With the skin complete, the next area of focus were the OGRYNS' trousers and vests. These were all painted with some camo olive green. As with the brown rose base coats, this was watered down and applied in a few thin layers. Again, following the same steps used to paint the armor earlier, the fabric was highlighted by mixing ice yellow into some camo olive green to create two increasingly lighter mixtures. These were then applied, first as a regular highlight, followed by an extreme highlight on the corners and sharper points. This process was then repeated across the boots and leather areas too, first with a base coat of saddle brown, followed by two highlights of saddle brown and ice yellow. Like with the armor, this highlight was also used to create a little damage to the edges of the leather too. For the skulls and OGRYNS' teeth, a base coat of English uniform was used. This was then highlighted with two ice yellow and English uniform mixtures. For the metallic areas, I opted to dip into the Pro Acryl range and selected some bronze to paint the various breast casings across the model. Continuing with another Pro Acryl paint, silver this time, I instead used this as a highlight across a few of the areas where damage would occur to reveal silvery scratches. The bayonets on the Ripper guns, as well as the tips of the spikes, were good examples of these. By this stage, the miniatures were not far off finished, but I felt that a little extra dirt and grime would go a long way. But before I could do this, I would need to protect the paintwork that I had already laid down, and this was done with a gloss varnish. Again, I used my airbrush for this, but a regular spray varnish could have worked here too. An easy way to add that desired dirt and muck was to use some of AK's streaking grime. Out of the pot, it was a little too strong though, so it was diluted with thinners. This less intense mix was then applied across everywhere with the exception of the skin. This thin mixture ran across the smooth gloss surfaces and pooled into the recesses, helping to add a little shading along with that grimy, unkempt look that I wanted to create. Feel free to go as heavy as you like with this step. If you want something really grimdark, then just layer it as desired. The final task was to paint the base. I'd selected one of the Sector Mechanicus bases as this reflected the environment of Darktide nicely. This had also been primed black, but to give it that metallic look, I chose to dry brush some of Pro Acryl's dark silver across the surface. While the whole base was coated with this dark metallic paint, I focused the application predominantly down a rough central line. This would just help to create an effect of shadows being cast by the OGRYN. Over the top of this, another extremely cheaty product was used. Dirty Down Rust is an excellent way of creating that incredibly rusted and worn effect that is common beneath the hives of the Imperium. This paint was applied directly from the pot across the whole base before some of the excess was wiped away using a slightly damp cloth. This meant that the grimiest parts remained in those deep recesses, whereas the areas that would have been worn down and scuffed still had a slight bit of that original metal still visible. Now that the bases were sufficiently rusty, the OGRYNS could be removed from their temporary bases that I'd used to hold them during painting. I'd only attached them using a small amount of superglue, which meant that they could easily be snapped away. Once removed, the undersides of their feet were cleaned up and the locations where their feet would go on the new base was also scraped back to bare plastic. This would allow me to use some plastic glue to reattach them. With the OGRYNS in place, the edges of the base could be cleaned up with some black paint, before removing that glossy finish and sealing in those final layers using some matte varnish. And with that, I was left with these. And here we have the completed OGRYNS, inspired by those found within Darktide. The techniques I've used here can easily be mixed and matched across numerous OGRYN squads to create some unique looking combinations. In fact, you can easily apply a lot of these techniques to other Imperial units in order to convert them to Chaos. If you enjoyed this Chaos Corrupting Kit Bash, then make sure you check out the many others that I've already done. And if you have any suggestions for more Chaos conversions you'd like to see me tackle, then leave them down in the comments. As always, I'll include all the paint sheets in this guide in the description, along with some affiliate links to a few of the tools and kits used to build these miniatures. Now, before I go, let me just say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Jack Ewan, Jonathan Hart, Tim, Brushlicker Nim, Daniel Dowling, Jesse Smith, Joachim Folk, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. If you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus, you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.